August 1942. The Pacific Ocean, once a vast and indifferent expanse of blue, had become a battlefield of storms and steel. After months of retreat and humiliation following Pearl Harbor, the United States had finally taken the offensive. Their first target was a name barely known to most Americans: Guadalcanal, a jungle-covered island buried deep within the Solomon Chain. To Washington, it was little more than a point on a map. To the Japanese, it was the outer shield of their empire. Whoever controlled it would control the sea lanes to Australia. When U.S. Marines landed there on August 7, 1942, they stepped into a world that seemed to belong to the enemy. Endless rain, suffocating humidity, and the constant, invisible presence of Japanese bombers above the clouds. For the Marines, life on Guadalcanal was a war of waiting. The men built foxholes in the red clay, hacked airstrips out of palm groves, and watched the horizon with rifles and cigarettes in hand. Each day brought the same haunting routine: the distant drone of engines, the sudden roar of sirens, and then the scream of bombs tearing through the jungle canopy. The Japanese operated from Rabaul, a massive airbase 600 miles to the north, launching waves of Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, escorted by nimble Zeros. The Americans could hear them coming long before they could see them, but by then, it was always too late. There was no warning system, no eyes beyond the clouds. The men in the trenches could only look up and pray that the next explosion wouldn't find them. The Marines nicknamed their ragtag collection of planes and pilots the Cactus Air Force, a symbol of both humor and defiance. They flew F-4F Wildcats, P-400 Airacobras, and a few patched-up SBD Dauntless dive bombers, operating out of the muddy runway at Henderson Field. Their mission was simple: keep the Japanese from retaking the island. But without any form of early warning, they fought blind. Pilots scrambled only after the first bombs had already fallen, climbing into the sky against an enemy that always had the advantage of surprise. "We fought by sound," one pilot later said. "By the time you heard them, they were already overhead." The situation grew desperate as the weeks dragged on. The Navy had withdrawn its carriers after suffering heavy losses at Savo Island, leaving the Marines cut off from reinforcements. Food was scarce, ammunition was rationed, and every night the men endured the terrifying Tokyo Express, Japanese destroyers that shelled Henderson Field from the sea. Yet even amid the exhaustion and fear, something remarkable began to take shape. Within the ranks of the Marine Signal Battalion, a small group of engineers and radio operators had an idea, one born from frustration, desperation, and the faint memory of a lesson unlearned. They remembered Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, a radar station on Oahu, an experimental unit of the Signal Corps using a new device called the SCR-270, had detected a large formation of planes approaching from the north. The warning had been ignored. Hours later, the Pacific Fleet was in flames. Now, less than a year later, someone decided that mistake would not be repeated. The Army and the Navy had begun deploying the SCR-270 across the Pacific, but no one had yet dared to test it in a place like Guadalcanal, a steaming, disease-ridden jungle where the humidity could short-circuit a radio in minutes. Still, the idea spread among the officers at Henderson Field. What if the Marines could see the enemy before he arrived? What if for once they could launch their fighters before the bombs fell? Colonel William E. Fisk of the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing approved the experiment. Within weeks, a small radar detachment was ordered to the island, barely a dozen men with a handful of crates, generators, and cables. Their destination? A small hill overlooking the sea, just west of Henderson Field, called Kukum Ridge. When they arrived in October 1942, they found nothing but thick jungle and red mud. The equipment was so heavy it had to be hauled up the hill in pieces by hand. The SCR-270 was enormous. Its antennae array stood nearly 30 feet high, a skeletal metal fan meant for airfields, not rainforests. The Marines hacked at vines, dug foundations, and built makeshift supports out of palm trunks.
Tropical rain poured down every afternoon, turning the ground into rivers of clay. Mosquitoes swarmed. Leeches clung to boots. Every time they managed to power the generator, the moisture caused the circuits to spark and die. It was like trying to build a cathedral out of driftwood during a hurricane. But slowly, piece by piece, the radar began to take shape. The generator was shielded with salvaged airplane parts. The antenna was reinforced with bamboo scaffolding, and the transmitter was wrapped in wax canvas to keep out the rain. The men nicknamed it the Beast on the Hill. At night, they worked by the dim light of flashlights, listening to the distant rumble of Japanese engines as they approached from the sea. Every morning, the same ritual repeated. Clean the connectors, check the cables, pray it wouldn't short out again, and every afternoon, as the bombers arrived, they cursed the machine for not yet working. But they didn't stop. We had no choice, Sergeant Ed Klein later recalled. Either we got that radar working, or we'd all be dead before the month was out. By late October, the enemy air raids had intensified. Japanese bombers came twice a day, sometimes 3 times a day, targeting fuel dumps, gun positions, and the airstrip itself. The Cactus Air Force was bleeding aircraft faster than replacements could arrive. The men at Kukum Ridge worked in total secrecy, their equipment camouflaged with palm leaves. If the Japanese discovered what they were building, it would be destroyed before it ever functioned. Then, one night, the sky fell silent. No planes came, no bombs dropped. The men took it as an omen, a pause before the next storm. In the darkness, up on the hill, the Marines switched on their generator one more time. The radar hummed to life. The green scope flickered. For the first time in the Pacific, a faint signal danced across the screen. Someone was out there. They had no idea that this flickering light on a cathode tube would change the entire war.
The Marines who built the radar on Kukum Hill were not pilots or frontline soldiers. They were technicians, quiet, methodical men who understood the strange language of electrons and static. Most of them had never seen combat before arriving at Guadalcanal. Their war was not fought with rifles, but with wrenches, vacuum tubes, and soldering irons. Yet in a war where knowledge could be deadlier than bullets, their mission was just as vital as any assault on a beachhead. The SCR-270 radar they had been ordered to assemble was already legendary in military circles. It was the same model that had spotted the incoming Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7, 1941. The radar had done its job, but the warning it provided was ignored. Now, a year later, on a jungle island half a world away, the same machine was being given a second chance to make history. The SCR-270 was a monster by any standard. The antenna array stood 30 feet tall, an octagonal frame of aluminum and copper mesh that rotated slowly to sweep the skies. It required a generator the size of a truck, several power amplifiers, and a network of delicate cables and transformers that could be ruined by a single drop of moisture. It was never designed to be used in a rainforest. The tropical air of Guadalcanal was so thick with humidity that metal rusted in a week and electronics corroded overnight. Even the mosquitoes seemed to attack anything that hummed with electricity. The men of the Marine Aircraft Wing Detachment G faced an engineering nightmare. Every piece of the radar had to be hauled by hand from the beach up the muddy slope of Kukum Hill. There were no cranes, no jeeps, just ropes, muscle, and determination. They dragged the generator through mud up to their shins, built scaffolds from palm trunks, and improvised insulation using wax paper and salvaged rubber from crashed aircraft. Rain poured constantly, shorting circuits and flooding trenches. When lightning struck nearby, it fried an entire set of vacuum tubes, forcing them to scavenge replacements from broken radios. Still, the Marines pressed on. We were building something that didn't belong in this world, but we knew it had to work because every day we waited, more of our boys were dying down at the airfield. Below them, the war never stopped. The Japanese attacked Henderson Field almost daily, sometimes with bombers, sometimes with artillery, sometimes with infantry. The Marines at the radar site could see the flashes of gunfire from the ridges at night and feel the tremors in the ground when naval shells landed near the coast. Each morning, they'd hike down to the airfield to share breakfast with pilots who had flown through hell the day before.
The pilots called them the ghosts on the hill, and often joked that the radar crew was fighting its own kind of battle. You boys are trying to outwit the weather, while we're trying to outfly the Zeros. Despite the hardship, there were moments of absurd humor. One day, a curious Japanese reconnaissance plane flew over the ridge, spotting the half-finished radar array glinting in the sun. Within minutes, a pair of Zeros swooped down to strafe it. The Marines dove for cover as bullets tore through the jungle canopy. When the planes left, they found several holes in the metal frame, but the structure still standing. One private, brushing leaves from his helmet, muttered, "Guess we just got our first test." Progress came slowly, but it came. The Marines built a bamboo platform to hold the transmitter above the mud. They rigged a drainage system from coconut logs. They grounded the antenna using steel salvaged from wrecked Japanese aircraft. The SCR-270 began to hum more steadily with each passing day. Every time the screen flickered with movement, birds, rain, even atmospheric interference, the operators took notes, learning to read the strange green echoes like a language. By mid-October, the machine was ready for its first full trial. The team calibrated the antenna to point north, toward the direction of Rabaul. They fired up the diesel generator, and the radar spinning suite painted faint traces across the scope. At first, it was chaos, noise, static, false returns. But then something remarkable happened. A small, steady blip appeared at the edge of the screen, moving slowly southward. The rangefinder marked it at 120 miles, well beyond visual detection. The crew stared in silence. For the first time on that island, they could see the enemy before he could see them. They radioed Henderson Field with the coordinates. The message was short. Multiple contacts inbound, estimated 60 miles north, altitude 12,000 feet. On the airfield below, pilots scrambled into their Wildcats. Engines roared to life. Within minutes, the planes lifted off the muddy strip, climbing into the overcast sky. When the Japanese bombers finally arrived over Guadalcanal, the Americans were already waiting for them. The intercept was swift and brutal. 10 bombers went down in flames before a single bomb struck the ground. From Kukum Hill, the radar operators could hear the distant rumble of dogfights and see the faint trails of smoke drifting eastward over the sea. They had just given the Cactus Air Force the one thing it had never had before: time. The news spread quickly through the camp. For the first time since the landings, the Americans had not been caught by surprise. The radar had worked. The beast on the hill had roared to life, and its echoes had turned the tide of an air battle. When the sun set that evening, the men gathered around the generator, covered in sweat and grime, staring at the spinning green light as though it were a miracle. Somewhere out in the dark, the Japanese pilots were reporting their shock to Rabaul. "Enemy fighters appeared before we reached the target," one of them wrote in his mission log. "It was as if they knew our path." They didn't know it yet, but from that day forward, the Americans on Guadalcanal would never fight blind again. By late October 1942, the trudge of war on Guadalcanal had become a rhythm of exhaustion. Every sunrise brought the same ominous hum, the distant throb of Mitsubishi engines somewhere beyond the horizon. The Marines at Kukum Hill, however, were ready. Their radar, the SCR-270, had finally been fine-tuned after weeks of trial and failure. Its tubes glowed faintly in the damp jungle air. Its generator coughed black smoke, and the 30-foot antenna, patched with bamboo and aircraft aluminum, turned slowly like a sentinel scanning the sky. For the first time, the Americans could see without eyes. At 07:35 hours on October 23, an operator named Sergeant Bill Woods was hunched over the cathode ray screen when he noticed a faint cluster of echoes appearing to the northwest. They were small at first, barely perceptible blips pulsing against the sweeping line, but they were moving fast and in formation. He called out immediately. "Contacts, bearing 315 degrees, range 90 miles, altitude approximately 10,000 feet. The word raced through the field phone line down to Henderson Field. Within 5 minutes, pilots were running to their aircraft. Captain Joe Foss, who would later become the Marine Corps' first ace of the war, pulled on his helmet as he sprinted toward his F-4F Wildcat. The loudspeakers blared across the airstrip. "Enemy inbound from northwest! Scramble! Scramble!" For the first time, the Cactus Air Force was not reacting to an explosion. They were launching before the enemy arrived. Up on Kukum Hill, the radar screen brightened. The blips were closing fast, now 70 miles, now 60. The operators could tell by their movement that the formation was tight and disciplined. That meant bombers. Another layer of slower-moving contacts trailed behind them, probably escorting Zeros. Woods' hand trembled as he adjusted the gain. The screen was alive with echoes. "They're coming in heavy. Real heavy." 15 minutes later, the first wave of G-4M Betty bombers from Rabaul broke through the cloud line over Iron Bottom Sound. But waiting for them at 15,000 feet were the Wildcats. Foss and his squadron dived out of the sun, catching the bombers completely off guard. In a storm of gunfire, the American fighters tore through the formation. 10 Japanese bombers were shot down in less than 6 minutes. The rest jettisoned their bombs over the sea and fled north. On the ground, Marines at Henderson Field watched the dogfight unfold high above the palm trees. For the first time, no bombs fell on their airstrip, no hangars burned. When the radio call came in, all enemy aircraft turned back. A cheer erupted from every foxhole. The radar crew on Kukum Hill, sweat-soaked and shaking from adrenaline, listened to the victory reports filtering in over the comms. They had saved lives, and they knew it. In the days that followed, the radar proved itself again and again. It detected new waves of aircraft long before they reached the island, giving the Marines time to prepare. Between October 23rd and November 3rd, the radar site reported more than 20 enemy raids. Each time the defenders were ready. The Japanese couldn't understand it. From their perspective, American fighters appeared out of nowhere, always at the perfect time, always at the perfect altitude. To the bewildered pilots of Rabaul's 705th Air Group, it seemed as though the Americans possessed supernatural foresight. They wait for us in the clouds. Even when we come at dawn, they are already there. The radar operators at Kukum began to refine their methods. They developed a coded alert system with Henderson Field, colors and numbers corresponding to distance and estimated time to impact. A single Red 15 over the radio meant enemy aircraft were 15 minutes out. The new system reduced confusion and saved precious seconds. It was warfare reduced to mathematics, and mathematics at last was on America's side. But radar was not a perfect weapon. The jungle humidity corroded connectors daily, the generator sputtered, and tropical storms sometimes blinded the scope. The men worked around the clock to keep it alive. They called it our temperamental lady, a moody, brilliant machine that saved lives when it worked and terrified them when it didn't. On November 12th, during one of the heaviest air raids of the campaign, the Kukum radar station detected an unusually large formation, more than 50 contacts approaching from 2 directions. It was a coordinated attack, one group of dive bombers from the north, another of torpedo planes from the east. The operators immediately sent the alert. Multiple groups inbound, split formation, mixed altitude. At Henderson Field, the sky filled with roaring engines as every available fighter took off. Above the island, the Wildcats and P-38 Lightnings formed a defensive web. When the Japanese arrived, they flew straight into a trap. The Americans tore into them from both flanks, downing 27 aircraft in less than half an hour. The few bombers that broke through dropped their payloads wildly, missing the airfield completely. The victory became known among the pilots as the Miracle of Kukum Hill. That night, Marines celebrated with canned rations and coffee. Up at the radar site, the operators toasted each other with rainwater and whiskey, the generator humming softly in the background. The Japanese never knew what happened that day. They simply concluded that the Americans had somehow become clairvoyant, that their defenses could sense incoming raids from hundreds of miles away. They were not entirely wrong. The jungle had grown eyes. By December, Kukum radar had become the backbone of Guadalcanal's air defense network. The Navy began flying in additional radar units to expand coverage. Crews from Hawaii and Australia arrived to learn from the jungle engineers who had made the impossible work. Word of their success reached Pearl Harbor, where officers of the Pacific Fleet began planning similar installations for every major island campaign to come. In just 6 weeks, a group of exhausted, mud-streaked Marines had changed the entire dynamic of the Pacific Air War. Radar was no longer an experiment, it was a weapon. And for the first time since the war began, America was fighting with the future on its side. As the year closed, the men of Kukum stood on their hill and watched the tropical sunset over Iron Bottom Sound. Below them, wrecked Japanese ships glimmered beneath the waves, silent markers of how far the war had turned. The jungle buzzed with insects, the radar swept in its endless rotation, and somewhere far to the north, another formation of bombers lifted off from Rabaul, unaware that the Americans already knew they were coming. By early 1943, the tide of the Guadalcanal campaign had begun to turn. The once isolated Marine outpost was now a fortress of coordination. Fighters taking off before dawn, bombers launching strikes at noon, and destroyers patrolling Iron Bottom Sound through the night. The men on Kukum Hill, who once worked in darkness and mud, had become something like wizards in the eyes of their comrades. Whenever they sent a coded alert over the radio, Red 30 North, altitude 10,000, everyone listened. It meant the jungle's invisible eyes had seen something that human eyes could not. To the Japanese, it felt like sorcery. Pilots from Rabaul, once confident in their raids, began reporting eerie patterns in combat. "They meet us every time," wrote one Japanese bomber captain after surviving a raid in December 1942. "They rise into the clouds before we arrive. They turn to meet us as if they can see through the horizon." Another pilot described Guadalcanal as an island of ghosts, an enemy that anticipated every move. The Imperial General Staff in Tokyo initially dismissed these reports as coincidence or pilot error, but after multiple squadrons returned decimated, Japanese intelligence began to suspect a new technology. Their own scientists knew of experimental radar research in Europe, yet they did not believe the Americans could have deployed it in the jungle. What they didn't realize was that the Kukum radar was not just surviving, it was evolving. The U.S. Navy had taken notice of its success and sent reinforcements, engineers, spare parts, and additional SCR-270 units. New relay stations were installed on nearby hills, creating a primitive but effective radar network covering the entire northern Solomon Sea. When Japanese bombers took off from Rabaul or Buin, they were tracked almost immediately. The information was relayed to Henderson Field and to patrol squadrons flying PBY Catalinas and F-4F Wildcats. This coordination allowed American fighters to ambush enemy formations hundreds of miles out, long before they reached the island. The system worked so well that the Japanese began to change their tactics. They switched to night raids, flying in darkness to avoid interception. But once again, the radar crew at Kukum adapted. Using the faint echoes on their scope, they learned to differentiate aircraft by speed and altitude, guiding anti-aircraft batteries and searchlights even when the enemy was invisible to the naked eye. The first time the radar successfully directed night gunfire, Japanese bombers dropped their payloads in panic, missing every target. One Marine officer watching the engagement whispered, "They thought they owned the night. Not anymore." The Japanese soon realized that Guadalcanal was becoming a death trap. Between October 1942 and January 1943, they lost over 600 aircraft in operations against the island, many destroyed before they could even strike. Each loss drained Japan's irreplaceable pool of trained pilots. The advantage of surprise, once the empire's strongest weapon, had been completely reversed. The Americans now held that power, and it came not from brute strength, but from knowledge. Life at Kukum Hill, however, remained brutal. The radar operators fought a different kind of battle, one against the jungle itself. Rain shorted circuits, termites ate through insulation, and the humidity corroded every connector. Spare parts were scarce, and the generator required constant nursing. The crew developed a ritual they jokingly called feeding the beast, cleaning every cable with alcohol, drying the circuits with heat lamps, and shielding the tubes with waxed cloth. They worked in shifts, sleeping in hammocks under leaking tarps, listening to the distant drone of engines in the night. Despite the hardships, morale was high. The men knew what their machine meant. Every time they detected an incoming raid, every time they heard the fighter squadrons intercept before the bombs fell, they felt the invisible weight of hundreds of lives saved. "We weren't heroes with guns," one radar technician said years later, "but we made sure the heroes could fight with their eyes open." By early 1943, the Kukum radar station had become the nerve center of the entire Cactus Air Force. Information from the radar guided not only air defense, but also offensive operations. When American bombers prepared to strike Japanese shipping lanes, Kukum provided timing windows and enemy air patrol patterns. When Navy supply ships approached the island, radar warned them of nearby enemy aircraft or submarines. It became the island's first and last line of defense, an unblinking watchtower in a war of shadows. Meanwhile, the Japanese tried to locate and destroy the radar. They bombed the hills around Kukum repeatedly, guided by reconnaissance photos that showed vague metallic shapes among the trees. But the Marines had camouflaged their installation with extraordinary ingenuity. They painted the antenna in mottled greens and browns, hung palm fronds over its frame, and even strung fake vines to break up its silhouette. To aerial observers, it looked like part of the jungle canopy. Not once did a bomb strike the radar directly. In February 1943, as the last Japanese forces evacuated Guadalcanal under the cover of night, the operators at Kukum were on duty. Their scopes showed faint echoes moving north, small, fast vessels retreating up the coast. The Americans didn't yet know it, but the enemy was leaving for good. When dawn came, the beaches were empty except for abandoned equipment and footprints in the sand. The Battle of Guadalcanal, which had begun 6 months earlier in fire and chaos, was over. The radar crew had outlasted the impossible. From a handful of crates and a generator, they had created the world's first functional jungle early warning system. They had turned the tide of the air war, protected thousands of lives, and laid the foundation for every radar network that would follow in the Pacific. When the news of victory reached Kukum Hill, the Marines didn't celebrate with parades or speeches. They simply gathered around their humming machine, watching its green line sweep the empty sky. For the first time in months, the scope showed nothing at all. No blips, no echoes, no threats. Just peace. As one operator later said, "We knew the war wasn't over, but for Guadalcanal, the radar had done its job. The sky was finally ours."
When the last Japanese transport ships disappeared over the northern horizon in February 1943, the island of Guadalcanal exhaled a weary sigh. The air still smelled of oil, cordites, and burnt palm trunks. But for the first time since August, there was silence. No engine hum, no bombs, no incoming blips on the glowing radar screen at Kukum Hill. The men who had built and operated the first jungle radar finally slept through the night, not from peace, but from sheer exhaustion. They had every reason to. What began as a desperate experiment had reshaped the balance of power in the Pacific. The SCR-270 radar on Kukum Hill had proven something revolutionary, that information could win battles before they even began.
It had transformed the air war over Guadalcanal from blind reaction to calculated interception, from chaos to control. And though the radar itself was just one machine among thousands, its impact reached far beyond the steaming jungles of the Solomon Islands. News of its success spread quickly through Allied command. Admiral William F. Halsey, then leading the South Pacific Force, called it the turning point of the unseen war. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics dispatched officers to study the Kukum installation. Engineers from Pearl Harbor flew in, documenting every modification the Marines had made to keep the radar alive under impossible conditions, from bamboo scaffolding to waterproofed connectors made with wax and chewing gum. These field reports became blueprints for a new generation of portable, tropicalized radar systems, later deployed across New Guinea, the Marianas, and the Philippines. By 1944, early warning radar networks had become the nervous system of the Pacific War. Islands like Saipan, Tinian, and Iwo Jima were ringed with radar outposts, all linked by radio and telephone lines to central command posts. Radar-controlled fighter direction centers could now guide interceptors in real time, vectoring them to within a mile of incoming Japanese raids. The technology pioneered in the mud of Guadalcanal had evolved into a continent-wide web of electronic awareness, one that Japan could neither evade nor match. The strategic consequences were profound. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the largest carrier battle in history, American radar picked up enemy formations hundreds of miles away, allowing Hellcat fighters to intercept them long before they reached the fleet. The result was what Japanese survivors called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Nearly 400 enemy aircraft were destroyed in a single day. The victory owed as much to radar-guided coordination as it did to superior aircraft. That ability to see first and strike first traced its lineage directly back to Kukum Hill. For the Japanese, radar remained a mystery for much of the war. Their scientists understood the principles, but production was limited and operational deployment was chaotic. They had no equivalent of the American radar network, no unified command structure linking their early warning systems with air defense squadrons. By the time they realized the extent of the Allied radar advantage, it was too late. Their bombers and ships were being hunted in the dark by invisible eyes. Meanwhile, the men of the original Guadalcanal radar detachment were rotated home or reassigned to new theaters. Many of them helped establish radar stations in New Guinea and Bougainville, training new crews under far better conditions. When interviewed after the war, several confessed that they had never truly understood how important their work had been at the time. "We just knew it was keeping our boys alive," said Sergeant Bill Woods, the operator who had spotted the first successful contact. "We didn't think we were changing how wars would be fought." But they had. After 1945, radar became not just a military tool, but a foundation of global defense. The lessons learned in the Pacific jungle were applied to everything from air traffic control to weather forecasting. The distant early warning line, the radar network that guarded North America during the Cold War, was designed by many of the same engineers who had studied Guadalcanal's SCR-270. Even the birth of modern stealth and counter-radar technology decades later traced its origins to the invisible battle that began on that humid hill. Today, little remains of the original Kukum site. The radar itself was dismantled after the war, its parts shipped home or scrapped. The jungle reclaimed the hill, vines curling over the places where generators once roared. But the story endures, in archives, in pilot diaries, and in the memories of those who lived long enough to tell it. At the Guadalcanal American Memorial, a bronze plaque honors the radar crews who brought sight to the blind skies. Visitors who climb the hill at sunset can still look out across Iron Bottom Sound and imagine the glow of that green screen pulsing in the dock. In the grand sweep of World War II, radar was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It did not fire bullets or drop bombs, yet it killed the enemy's most dangerous advantage: surprise. The Japanese had once ruled the Pacific through speed, coordination, and the element of the unexpected. The Marines on Kukum Hill took that from them. They turned knowledge into armor, silence into warning, and electricity into life. Their machine was crude, their tools were primitive, but in that moment, under the weight of heat and fear and isolation, they built something that would outlast the war itself, a new way of fighting. As one pilot later said, reflecting on those dark days above Guadalcanal, "We didn't win because we were stronger. We won because, for the first time, we could see." And it all began on a small hill in the jungle, where the night had once belonged to the enemy, and where, in the glow of a trembling radar screen, the future learned to look back.